We're going to start in the US. Brittney Griner, the basketball star jailed in Russia for cannabis oil possession, has arrived back in the US now after Moscow and Washington arranged an exchange of prisoners. Here's the moment she stepped off the plane in San Antonio Brooke Army Medical Center. She'll have a medical assessment there. Griner's freedom came in return for the release of an American, Viktor Bout, a notorious Russian arms dealer, nicknamed the Merchant of Death. He's already arrived back in Moscow, flying in from Abu Dhabi, where the exchange took place. The terms were signed off by President Biden, leading to criticism that he could have helped other Americans detained in Russia. Here's our reporter, Tom Brada.
This is the moment the basketball star, Brittney Griner, finally landed back in the US, home after more than 290 days of detention in Russia. Just last month, she was sent to a penal colony. So her sudden freedom came as a surprise. This footage, released by the Russian authorities, shows her being given the news.
Do you know where I'm heading to?
No.
No?
No.
You fly back home?
To the US.
To the US.
Okay.
The US government secured Miss Griner's release through an exchange. She was traded for a notorious arms dealer, Viktor Bout, widely known as the Merchant of Death, and the pair briefly crossed paths on the tarmac at Abu Dhabi. Mr. Bout had been in a US jail for 12 years. Hours after the trade was complete, he was back in Moscow. Brittney Griner was arrested at a Moscow airport back in February for the possession of cannabis oil cartridges, and later she was sentenced to 9 years in jail. Her wife celebrated the news of her early release.
Thank you, everybody, for your support. And today is just a happy day for me and my family, so I'm going to smile right now.
The basketball star's teammates praised her character.
Off the court, I would say she's such a kind, nice, and giving person. Always willing to give a helping hand, always willing to help someone in need, whether it's giving someone a free meal or giving someone a ride. She's honestly one of the most generous people that I know.
But there has also been criticism. Some are concerned that President Biden sanctioned the release of a man with as dangerous a track record as Mr. Bout. Others are angry that he left another US citizen behind. This is Paul Whelan, an American currently being held on suspicion of spying. The White House had originally offered to swap Viktor Bout for Brittney Griner and Mr. Whelan, but Russia flatly refused. For now, many Americans will be celebrating the basketball star's return. After 10 months in Russian custody, she's finally back on home turf. Tom Brada, BBC News.
Well, Robert Zaharishvili was one of the agents involved in Viktor Bout's arrest back in 2008, and he told the BBC World Service that he was disappointed to see him released.
Today's actions just placed a target on the back of every United States citizen traveling throughout the world, and they just became a commodity. I think that we just sent the message that it's really good business to illegally detain and, if not kidnap, American citizens. And it's great to have one in your back pocket if you need them for a trade at some point.
Well, let's speak now to Valerie Hopkins, a Russia correspondent for the New York Times. Thanks very much for coming on the programme.
Thank you very much for having me. Those were chilling words to hear as an American citizen sitting in Moscow right now.
Yeah, well, let's get your thoughts on just that. I mean, do you think that is a valid criticism of what's gone on here?
Well, you know, it's really not my place to make that decision, but I did speak to a number of former diplomats, you know, people who are involved in this, who have a stake in the game. And, you know, while some American officials I spoke to said that, you know, any American that's freed is good, and any decision to bring someone home is helpful. I did speak to a Russian analyst in exile, an expert, Andrei Soldatov, who's actually in exile in London now because of his own threats from the Russian government, who said that this sets a very worrying precedent because, you know, if during the Cold War there were sort of rules of the game in that, you know, spies were arrested for spies, etc. Now, you know, this is a system where Putin and his government have realized that it's actually quite useful for them to have what he called a bank of hostages, something that started to develop already 20 years ago during the Chechen War. But you know, as the rules are now new rules of the global system, new rules of West-Russia relations are being written. it is quite concerning to see how this might change.
Indeed. Let's move on now to Victor Bout. What do we know about what happens to this man now and how dangerous he remains?
Well, it's unclear what kind of role Victor Bout is going to take on in public life. And it's also unclear, what kind of relationships he still maintains. Mr. Soldatov, who I spoke to yesterday, said, it's almost, we don't have, of course, any proof, but many experts and those who study the Russian security services do believe that Mr. Bout was part of military intelligence. And some people believe that, despite his years and years in American detention, he still maintains some of his networks, some of his contacts. And those networks, Mr. Soldatov said, would possibly be very useful for Russia now, as it becomes more and more isolated from the West and tries to engage, deepen its engagement with Africa, with the Middle East, places where Mr. Bout spent a lot of time traveling, doing business, and building ties. Mr. Soldatov, for instance, also suggested that perhaps Mr. Bout's networks would be useful to Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is in charge of the Wagner Group, the private army that is, close to Putin, which is also expanding its operations in Africa and the Middle East. So,
Right.
However, Mr. Bout is portrayed here as a hero, as someone who never testified and never revealed any information that would have been important for the Russian state. And he's been rewarded with a hero's welcome here at home.
OK, and just before I let you go, I want to ask you about Mr. Whelan, US citizen, of course, still being held in Russia. And there's been criticism that he hasn't been involved in this deal.
Yes, I actually traded messages yesterday with Mr. Whelan's twin brother, David, who said he was really disappointed and was hoping that it would be possible to get him home. Their hopes were really raised over the summer when the prospect of a 2-for-1 deal was first floated. But Moscow was very clear that they didn't want to have a 2-for-1, and I think that President Biden said that they've also made it clear that either Brittney was coming home in exchange for Mr. Bout or no one. There are already several possibilities being discussed. Among them is the possibility of trading Mr. Whelan for a Russian citizen who's been detained in Germany for murdering someone in a public park, murdering a Chechen dissident. But of course, I have no inside information or insight into that. And that would be a very complicated, it involves more than two governments. So it would be a very complicated negotiation.
OK, we have to leave it there. Valerie Hopkins, thanks so much for coming on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much.